Good evening. Because it's Christmas week, we're going to do something a little bit different with our show. We're going to have a Christmas special, and our guest will be a book. I'm going to read you a Christmas story. This is from a series of books by a woman named Eleanor Estes, who wrote this series of books about a family named Moffat. And the Moffat family consisted of a widow and 4 children growing up in a small town in Connecticut in the 19-teens. This is during the time of World War I. And they're rather a poor family, not miserably poor. They always eat, but they have to sort of struggle to get by. And there's 4 children in the family. Well, there's the mother, just known as Mama, who is probably about 40 or so. Then there's the eldest daughter, Sylvia, who is about 17. The eldest boy, Joey, is about 14. Then there's the third child, Jane, who's maybe 10. And the baby of the family is Rufus, a little boy who's about 7. And most of these stories, not all, but most, are told from the point of view of the third child, Jane. And this is from the second book of the series. It's called The Middle Moffat, which is what Jane called herself. And this is a chapter about one of their family Christmases. This would almost certainly be Christmas of 1917. And this story is called A Letter from Santa Claus. Rufus wanted a pony. In this, he was no different from every other small boy. Every Christmas, Rufus asked Santa Claus for one. In his letters to Santa Claus, a pony always topped the list. Oh, of course, he used to ask for other things too. A bicycle, a top, an engine, toy soldiers, a jackknife. But the pony was what he wanted more than anything else in the world. He tried in his letters to point this out to Santa Claus. For instance, in one letter he put a gold star by the word pony. In another he wrote pony in red crayon. Still, Santa Claus didn't seem to catch on, and he never brought a pony. He brought other fine things, pea blowers, horns, drums, and Rufus was grateful for them, but they didn't answer that longing he had inside for a pony. How did he get it into his head he wanted a pony? Well, one day, a couple of years ago, when the Moffats were living in the Yellow House on New Dollar Street, a man had come along leading a black and white pony. You could have your picture taken sitting on its back for 10 cents. Mama said Rufus should have one taken. She would frame it and put it on the mantel. So the man picked Rufus up and set him on the pony's back and took his picture. Then the man let Rufus ride the pony as far as Huey Pudge's house. There, however, he had to get down and let Huey Pudge get up, for he was going to have his picture taken too. Ever since that time, when he had felt real pony flesh between his legs, Rufus had wanted a pony, just terribly. Last Christmas, Santa had brought him a brown felt pony on wheels, all right for very small children perhaps, but certainly not the thing for him. After this experience, Rufus decided he had better add the word alive after pony. This Christmas, Mama said to the children, "Don't ask Santa Claus for too much this year, because you know there's a terrible war going on in Europe, and Santa Claus will need an extra large amount of things for the Belgian children." So one evening, after the supper dishes had been cleared away, Jane and Rufus took pencil and paper to the kitchen table, pushed back the red checked tablecloth, and wrote their letters to Santa Claus. Jane wrote, "Dear Santa Claus, please bring me 2 storied pencil box, flexible flyer sled, box of paints, Princess and Curdy." Then she stopped for a moment. She would like to say, "Please don't bring any material for a dress or anything to wear or for practical's sake." But perhaps Santa Claus would not think that was polite, so she signed, "With love, Jane Moffat." She looked over at Rufus's letter. "Have you finished?" she asked. "Not quite," he answered. His tongue was between his teeth, and he was working very hard. Jane watched him curiously, for he was no longer writing, but drawing something on his letter with brown crayon. "How many things you ask for?" he demanded presently. "4," said Jane. "4," repeated Rufus. "I only asked for 1." He announced with satisfaction, and when he finally laid down his crayon, he held his letter up and surveyed it approvingly. "Can I look at it?" asked Jane. Looking at one another's letters to Santa Claus was usually an unheard of procedure. They were for Santa's eyes alone. But this letter Rufus was proud of, and he pushed it over to Jane with a magnanimous gesture. This was Rufus's letter. "Dear Santa Claus, please bring me a pony, alive, Rufus." "Gee, that's nice," approved Jane. "Think he'll know what I mean?" "Sure." "Maybe I better add the words real one under the picture just to make sure," said Rufus. So he carefully printed the words real one under his drawing and was convinced that now he had made it plain to Santa Claus what he wanted for Christmas. He and Jane took their letters to the kitchen stove, lifted the lid, and dropped them into the red-hot coals. The draft whisked them up the chimney, and the charred letters were gone. "Funny how he can read them when they're burned up like that," said Rufus. "He just can," said Jane with finality. Rufus went back to the kitchen table and wrote another letter with a picture of an alive pony on it. This he gave to Mama to put in her bag and mail it in the big post office tomorrow when she went to town. "I'm sure he'll get one or another of them," said Rufus. Jane sat down before the kitchen fire to warm her toes. "Dear God," she prayed, "tell Santa Claus to bring him the pony." She could not bear to think of another Christmas day with no pony for Rufus. Then she began thinking about what to give Mama this Christmas, something especially lovely. What was the loveliest thing she could think of? She watched the sparkling coals, and suddenly she had a wonderful idea. The gift should be a beautiful bag, brocaded and sparkling with gold and silver threads, all embroidered together in a gorgeous pattern. Yes, she had seen such a bag once in a store window on Chapel Street in town. Certainly that was the gift for Mama. She called Joey and Rufus. She didn't call Sylvie because Sylvie already had her presents wrapped and hidden in the top shelf of the pantry. "How much money you got?" she asked them. "What do you want to know for?" they both countered. Jane told them about her bag. She painted it in glowing colors. "It'll be lovely. It'll be shiny all over," she ended up. Rufus and Joey were impressed. They liked the idea. Well now, a brocaded bag for Mama, that was something. Rufus disappeared in the closet under the stairs and came back with his old Prince Albert tobacco box he kept his treasures in. Among the bottle tops in it, he found a few pennies, 6 in all. He dropped them in Jane's lap. Joe put his hand in his pocket. He kept his money there when he had any, like a grown man. He pulled out 2 nickels and 2 pennies and dropped them in Jane's lap. Jane opened the little Chinese purse that Mama and Sylvie had bought her from New York's Chinatown. A nickel and 4 pennies fell out of this. Altogether, it looked quite a pile. She scooped it up in the palm of her hand. 27 cents, she announced with satisfaction, shaking the coins up and down, up and down. "Will that buy one of those bags?" asked Joe incredulously. "Oh, no. They cost $1 at least. I'm going to make this brocaded bag." "Supposing you don't finish it before Christmas?" asked Joe. "Then I'll have nothing for Mama." "I'll finish it," said Jane positively. And she painted the bag she would make in glowing terms, for she saw now that their enthusiasm was lagging. "Tomorrow we'll go to Aberdeen's and get the things," she concluded, exhausted from all this persuading, and putting all the coins in her purse. The next day it was snowing very hard. It had begun in the middle of the night. Silently, a soft, thick mantle had been laid over the earth, and it was growing thicker by the minute. Jane and Joe and Rufus ran to the front window and looked out. Marvelous! The first deep snow of winter. They waved goodbye to Sylvie, who was making her way with difficulty through the deep drifts. "Where's she going?" asked Rufus. "To Parish House to rehearse for the Christmas tableau," said Jane. "Come on, get ready to go to Aberdeen's and get the things." They put on their rubbers. "Where are you going?" asked Mama. Jane made grimaces at Rufus and Joe to keep them from saying Aberdeen's. That was to be a real surprise. We're just going out to play in the snow, said Jane carelessly. All right, said Mama, but don't be gallivanting all over town, and come in when your feet get wet. Out into the snow they ran. The whole world was white. Soon they looked like snowmen. Boy, oh boy, I'll have plenty of shoveling to do when we get back, said Joe. Although they could walk on the sidewalk, most of which had been cleared by the snowplow, they preferred to walk through the deep snow on the side of the pavements. At last they reached Aberdeen's department store, the only large store in Cranberry. Rufus ran up to the show window and stretched his arms out wide. They pushed open the door. They sniffed the strange smells here, bolts of new material, rubber raincoats and overshoes, powder and perfumes. Mrs. Aberdeen herself, dressed in many sweaters and a black apron, came out to wait on them. She had a pencil stuck in the bun of her hair, a tape measure around her neck, and a pair of scissors strung on a black silk ribbon dangling from her bosom. Mrs. Aberdeen looked more like Madame the Bust than anyone else in Cranberry. Jane looked at her, wondering how to begin. It was clear that Mrs. Aberdeen was not going to guess what they wanted. Well, speak up, said Mrs. Aberdeen. A spool of thread, yard of elastic, garters, buttons? No, said Jane. Well, we're all giving it, but I'm making it. I want to make a bag for Mama for Christmas. Oh, I see. Well, now how much money can you spend? Well, 27 cents won't buy much. Here's a nice piece of goods you can have for that money, said Mrs. Aberdeen, holding up a piece of blue calico. I want to embroider the bag, Jane replied faintly. Mrs. Aberdeen pulled out a skein of white embroidery cotton. There, she said kindly, I'm sure that will make a very nice bag. These things don't shine. Something is wrong, thought Jane, almost sobbing. But she paid the money, and Mrs. Aberdeen deftly wrapped up the cloth and the embroidery thread in crackling green paper. With a real bought package under her arm, Jane felt better. Then, too, the plain blue calico was out of sight, and her vision of the brocaded bag returned in full force. It danced before her, a lovely, elusive thing that quickened her pace. Joe and Rufus practically had to run to keep up with her. Mama was in the kitchen, so they unwrapped the green package in a little green and white parlor with eager fingers. They would not have been surprised had the blue calico changed into a brocaded bag on the way home. However, the blue calico was still blue calico, though it was obvious from Jane's joyful spirits that she would have this transformed into the other lovely thing in no time. During the next few days, Jane worked hard on the bag. She cut it out and sewed it up, every stitch by hand. She embroidered Mama on one side of it with the white embroidery thread. On the other, she embroidered a daisy. When she finished it, she held it up and surveyed it with satisfaction. The brocaded bag. She saw it flash and sparkle and gleam with different shining colors. It was the very bag she had seen in the big store window in town. In excitement, she called Joe and Rufus in to see the finished bag. She dangled it before them, walked mincingly with it on her arm, as elegant ladies do. Is that a brocaded bag? They asked wonderingly. Yes, said Jane. Isn't it lovely? And she walked up to the mirror to look at herself with the pretty thing. Her eyes fell on the bag. What they saw there was a very plain blue calico bag with a crooked Mama embroidered on one side and a humpback daisy on the other. She looked down at the real bag hanging on her arm. The fair vision of the brocaded bag vanished completely and forever. She fell silent. The boys said nothing. After all, they had never seen a brocaded bag. In a while, Jane said thoughtfully, "It'll be good to keep buttons in." They wrapped it up and made a card for it, to Mama with love from Joe, Rufus, and Jane, and hid it where Mama would not be able to find it. At last it was Christmas Eve. The four Moffats were making decorations for the tree, angels of gold and silver paper, baskets for candy and cookies, chains of colored paper, cornucopias for popcorn. The kitchen table was quite covered with scraps of paper and sticky with flour and water paste, which Rufus had dabbed around by mistake. Sylvie had shown him how to make the chains of circles in bright paper. It was true that all of his chains were not linked together properly. His chain broke into short separate links that hung aimlessly from the hole. However, Sylvie said this did not matter in the slightest. Sylvie and Mama were going to help Santa Claus out by having the tree trimmed before he came late tonight. At present, they were busy making the spiced Santa Claus cookies for the tree. How good they did smell. "It's time now to hang your stockings," said Mama. The four of them, even Sylvie, tore off to their rooms to find stockings that didn't have any holes in them so none of the good things would fall out of the heel or toe. They tacked these onto the wainscoting behind the kitchen stove, right handy for Santa Claus. Now there was really nothing to do but go to bed. Rufus and Janey went first. They stripped off their clothes before the kitchen fire. Then they put on their outing flannel bed socks and nightclothes and raced noisily up the stairs to bed. But not to sleep, not yet. They talked and laughed, smothering their giggles under the bedclothes. Then they whispered, "What do you think Santa Claus will bring us?" "Let's stay awake all night and watch for Santa Claus," said Rufus. "Oh, what do you think Sandy will bring?" Rufus asked this for the 100th time, although there was really little doubt in his mind. Had he not written Santa Claus the same letter every night for a week, telling him to bring a real live pony, even showing by drawings exactly what he meant? Goodness knows how many of these letters had found their way to Santa Claus. So many, probably, that Rufus had grown rather worried at the last and varied his letter to read, "Dear Santy, please bring me a live pony. One is plenty. Rufus." "Goodness," he chuckled, "if Santy brought a pony for every letter I wrote, but I guess he'll know better than that." In spite of themselves, they began to grow sleepy. Then Joe came to bed and talked for a while, but soon Joey and Rufus became quiet, and Jane knew they were asleep. Jane stayed awake, however. Her chilblains itched her, but she wasn't thinking about them so much. She was thinking about Rufus and that pony he expected. He certainly does want that pony, she thought. He wants that pony harder than I have ever wanted anything. And this year he was so positive that Santa would bring one. Nevertheless, Jane had a sinking feeling in her stomach that Christmas morning would come and there just would not be a pony for Rufus. What should she do? His disappointment would be more than she could bear. Something ought to be done, she worried, but what? And then Sylvie came upstairs and climbed into bed. "Asleep, Janeykin?" she asked softly. Jane didn't answer, pretending to be asleep. There was no use troubling Sylvie about this pony business, too, and after a while she could tell from Sylvie's breathing that Sylvie was asleep. For a long time Jane lay there. Supposing she stayed awake this year and listened for Santa Claus. A word in his ear about the pony might work wonders. Other years she had meant to do this, but somehow morning had always come and the stockings had been filled as if by magic, and she would realize that she had gone to sleep and missed Santa Claus after all. He had come in the middle of the night. This year would be different, though. She would stay awake. Yes, she would. She listened to all the night noises, the frost making the window panes creak, Mama calling Catherine the cat, Mama turning the key in the latch, winding the clock, shaking down the kitchen fire and the fire in the parlor. Finally, she heard Mama drop first one shoe and then the other with a soft thud to the floor, and she knew that Mama, too, was in bed. Now, all she had to do was listen for Santa Claus. Surely he would be here soon. It must be very late, midnight probably. She would stay awake and stay awake. She would say to him, "Please, Santy, a pony for Rufus." The first thing she would hear would be the sleigh bells and the reindeer's hooves on the roof. She must stay awake. In telling her best friend Nancy about this later, Jane was positive she had stayed awake. Positive that just as the clock in the sitting room downstairs struck 12, Santa Claus had stood beside her bed and gently turned her over. His frosty beard had even brushed her cheek, and he had whispered something in her ear. But just as she was about to speak to him, he had vanished, and the sleigh bells tinkled off in the distance. She sat up in bed. Sylvie was sleeping peacefully. Santa Claus had gone. Of that she was sure. Oh, why had he not waited for her to speak? Softly she crept out of bed, felt her way past the chiffonnier into the hall, and stole down the creaking stairs to the kitchen. She was grateful for the faint light that shone from the kitchen stove. Finding the matches, she struck one. Catherine the cat's eyes shone green and examined her with keen disapproval. Paying no attention to her, Jane glanced swiftly behind the stove. There the 4 stockings hung, bulging now. Yes, that proved it. Santa had been here just now and had come to her side to give her some message. She glanced around the room and peeked into the little parlor where the Christmas tree was shining. There was no pony about, that was certain. She tiptoed to the back window and pressed her face against the pane. The moon shone over the white snow, making a light almost as bright as day. If there had been a pony out there, she would know it. There just wasn't any pony, and there was no use hoping for it any longer. That was why Santa had come to her bedside. He knew she was awake and waiting, and he had a good reason for not bringing the pony, and that's what he had wanted to tell her. What was the reason? She thought for a moment. Then she knew. She lit another match, found a piece of brown wrapping paper and a pencil, and crouching on the floor near the stove, she wrote, "Dear Rufus, all the ponies are at the war. Your friend, Santa Claus." She tucked this note in the top of Rufus's stocking and went back to bed. Shivering, she pressed her cold self against Sylvie and fell sound asleep. The next thing she knew, Sylvie was shaking her and screaming, "Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas!" Jane jumped out of bed, pulled a blanket round her, danced wildly out of the room, screaming, "Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas!" Mama gave them each a sweet hug and a kiss and said, "Merry Christmas, everybody." The whole house echoed, and Catherine the cat chased her tail for the first time in 5.5 years. They grabbed their stockings and raced back to bed with them, for the house was still bitterly cold. A sudden yell from Rufus interrupted everything. "Woo!" he shouted. "Woohoo! Listen to this! Ma, listen! I've had a letter from Santa Claus!" Rufus jumped out of bed and tore through the house like a cyclone, the others following him. "Listen to this," he said, again when they were finally collected before the kitchen fire. "Dear Rufus," it says, "Dear Rufus, all the ponies are at the war." And it's signed, "Your friend, Santa Claus." Imagine a letter from Santa Claus himself. Mama put on her glasses and examined the note carefully. She said. "Oh, gee," said Rufus. "Wait till I show this to Eddie Bangs." He's always boasting of his autographs collection. He's got President Taft and Mayor Harley, Chief Mulligan, but he ain't got Santa Claus. Jane could see that having a letter from Santa Claus himself softened considerably Rufus's disappointment in not getting a real live pony. When calm was somewhat restored, the gifts were taken from the tree. These were some of the most exciting moments. When Mama opened her brocaded bag and said, "This will be elegant to keep buttons in." When Rufus opened his toy village, houses, trees, grocery boys on bicycles, delivery men with horses and wagons, firemen and fire engines, a postman, a policeman, a milkman. Yes, a complete village to lay out with streets and parks. When Jane opened her miniature grocery store with tiny boxes of real cocoa and salt, sacks of sugar, and the smallest jars of real honey. When Sylvie opened a huge box and drew out a fluffy white dress that Mama had secretly made for her first ball, the junior-senior promenade. And when Joe opened a long, slim package that had a shining clarinet in it, boy, oh boy, was all he could say. But now it was time for Sylvie to go to church and take her part in the Christmas tableau. Of course, all the Moffats were going to watch her and join in the beautiful Christmas carols. Before they left, however, Mama gathered them all around the tree. And they sang, Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Peace on earth and mercy mild, God and sinners reconciled. You know, I remember the first time I read this story aloud was Christmas of the year 2000. I was living in New York City at the time, and my girlfriend at that time was living in Los Angeles, and we did not get to see each other very often. But we would have phone dates practically every night. I think literally every night for a year, until we finally ended up in the same town and started living together. And sometimes it would comfort her to have me read to her. And so I would read something or other, children's stories as often as not. And here it was Christmas, and we were not going to be together on Christmas Day. So instead, late on Christmas Eve night, I read her this story. And, you know, it might have not been the merriest Christmas of all time because I wasn't with my girlfriend and wasn't really with anybody else. But it was certainly one of the most romantic Christmases I can recall having. And maybe if you are not with whom you would like to be with physically on Christmas, you might want to call them up, read them a story, tell them a story. It's a nice thing to do. So on that note, I will say a Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night.